Thank you all for signing on here. This is the first time that we've done a webinar like this, at least with me in my position here. I started on May 1st as the Director of Business Advocacy for the Eugene Chamber, and I am jumping in headfirst with mandatory sick leave as my first issue. So we are hoping to sort of explore some other ideas and ways to get the information out to folks, because this is a really important issue that we know is going to affect a lot of people and a lot of businesses. So we want to make sure that we're doing what we can from the chamber to make sure you all are educated and you feel comfortable with the ordinance that is looking like it's set up to pass in a couple weeks from now. So hopefully most of you are already engaged in this issue. You are on our list of people who are interested in learning more, so that's how we reached out to you. So you are probably hopefully a little bit familiar with it, but this might give you a little more information about where we are right now and where we're going with this. I'm going to start with how we got to where we are. A lot of folks don't even know where this issue came from. It kind of feels like it was out of the blue for a lot of people, and it was. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and the process that we've gone through so far. We're also going to look at what the ordinance includes and a little bit about what it doesn't include and how that process is going to go as well. We'll talk about the Chamber's position, which has been pretty obvious and transparent to the community and especially to you folks, but we'll talk about how we got there and some of the points that we've been arguing right now. The last couple things we'll touch on is why you should testify or show up at least to the city council or county commissioners meeting and what that means. If you haven't been before, it can be intimidating sometimes to walk into a meeting, you're not really sure what's going on. So we'll walk you through that briefly. And then how to give a killer testimony. I'm sure several of you have already done this before, and so you're great at it, but just some tips, especially related to this issue, so we can make sure that we are getting our points across as best as possible. So let's get started here with how we got to where we're at right now. Back in February, there are a couple different advocate groups. Families Forward Oregon and Main Street Alliance are the Oregon chapters of those organizations that have been traveling across the country lobbying for these sick leave ordinances. Some of you might be familiar with the ordinance that they have in San Francisco. There's one in Seattle and one in Portland on the West Coast. Portland's ordinance went into effect January 1 of this year, and they adopted that ordinance the previous March. So they went through an extensive administrative ruling process similar to what we are about to start, but we'll talk a little bit more about how their process was different than ours in a couple minutes. So once the lobbyists got in touch with City Council and let them know this is something they wanted to pursue, Council agreed and said that they would like to entertain the idea. They had their first work session at the end of February and then held another one in April. In those two work sessions, Council directed city staff to use the Portland ordinance as a template for what Eugene was going to adopt for several reasons, one of which is if they are going to try and pursue a statewide push for this, it would, in the advocates' eyes, make more sense if Eugene and Portland had similar ordinances. So after that April work session, there was some pressure from the opponents, the Eugene Chamber being one of them, to slow the process down a little bit and to engage in conversation with folks who this is going to impact. And out of that, a task force was created to discuss the issue. Unfortunately, it turned into more of a conversation type meeting and less about making recommendations. The staff and the council members who were on that made it very clear that there were not going to be any recommendations from the task force for the council made out of that process. So finally, on July 3rd, the City of Eugene published a draft ordinance. This is pretty backwards from most of the process. Usually an ordinance will be proposed early and then there's time to discuss it and analyze it and talk about how it's going to work for Eugene. This one, they kind of went about it backwards, and the ordinance was finally published on July 3rd, which made it really interesting because up until that point, we couldn't even talk about what the Eugene ordinance looked like because we didn't have one. So now we do have one. We can talk a little bit more about that. And then kind of a curveball came in on July 8th. The Lane County Commissioners met and discussed about the mandatory sick leave ordinance in Eugene, and they had heard several concerns from businesses within Eugene, but then also businesses outside of Eugene that are still within Lane County who potentially will have to comply with this ordinance as well, the way that it is written. It currently applies to folks who are outside of Eugene but send people into Eugene, and those hours those people work here. So in an effort to support the businesses, they came up with 3 different ordinances that they proposed, which we'll talk a little bit more about later as well. So the ordinance that is currently proposed mandates that all employees working within Eugene city limits accrue 40 hours of paid and protected sick leave per year. That's about as vague as they've left it. There are a lot of other details in the Portland ordinance about how that is mandated and how businesses have to comply, but we aren't really sure of that yet here in Eugene because they've left that up to an administrative ruling process, which I'll explain in just a minute here too. The ordinance includes a requirement that time be accrued from the start date of the employee, from the time the employee starts, or from the date the ordinance starts, which right now is July 1st of 2015. So starting then, they are able to accrue 1 hour for every 30 hours that they work. And they can start redeeming those sick hours after 90 days of being with your business. So a lot of people offer sick time, but they don't let people use it for 6 months or maybe a year. That's a piece of a lot of HR policies that's going to have to change if you're going to comply with the ordinance. Another piece, the paid sick leave must be allowed to roll over, but use cannot exceed 40 hours. So if someone uses 20 hours in 1 year, they can roll over 20 hours, but they can't ever use more than 40 hours the next year. So it doesn't become a bank of 60 hours then, but they do allow rollover with the way the ordinance is written now. Some highlights, the ordinance does not have a small employer exception like Portland or Seattle. In Portland, if you have 5 or fewer employees, you have to offer protected sick leave, but not paid sick leave. The Eugene City Council made a decision to include all employers in this ordinance, and that is a piece that the Chamber has been fighting diligently. We think that Eugene and really all of Oregon is made of small businesses, and those are the folks who this is really going to impact and hit hard. So we're still lobbying for them to include that small employer exception, but as of right now, it's not looking very promising. So make sure to pay attention to that there's a lot of folks who thought they were going to be exempt who in Eugene are probably not going to be. Another highlight, an employer, as stated in the ordinance, is anyone who leases or owns property in Eugene where at least 1 employee works. So there's some legal complications with the way that is written, and we're working with Chris Pryor on the City Council to try and help offer him some suggested amendments to that might address the issue, but in a different way, so it doesn't have an unintended consequence that they're trying to work around. All employees, including temporary and part-time employees, are covered. So this isn't just applying to your full-time folks. This is for temporary and part-time employees. They'll accrue that time at 1 hour per 30 hours. So they might accrue it slower than full-time folks will, but they are still covered with this ordinance. I'm going to take a break there to pop out and see if there's any questions. All right, looks like everybody's doing good so far. If you have any, please feel free to type those in, and I will make sure to pay attention to that. All right. So what isn't in the ordinance? So as of right now, the Eugene ordinance is extremely vague compared to the Portland ordinance in the way that it was written. Several of the details, they're leading up to an administrative ruling process. What that's going to look like is the city manager has been given permission to create a group of folks, which they've at least made clear that they're going to hopefully include HR professionals, some business folks, advocates will be at the table. The chamber hopefully will have a seat at that table as well to work out some of the more detailed work of this ordinance. Some things that aren't included right now, a hard definition of an employee or an employer. That's something that's really important to this ordinance that they are leaving up to the administrative ruling. They haven't identified how paid time off will work with this ordinance. In Portland, There were portions that if you offered paid time off that was as generous as the ordinance and that followed the outline of the ordinance, then you would be able to keep using that paid time off policy. Eugene seems as if they're going that direction, but it's not stated for certain in the ordinance right now. They haven't talked about when sick time can be used, so for what purposes and who, if you can leave because your daughter is sick or your grandmother is sick, that'll be laid out in the administrative rules. And then also in what increments. In Portland right now, you can use it in 1 hour increments, which for a lot of employers is kind of problematic because it makes it a little difficult to track and make sure folks aren't abusing that policy. So we're fighting for at least 4 hour increments. We'll see how that goes in the administrative ruling process. We'll work out record keeping, accrual requirements, enforcement protocol. So right now in the ordinance, it leaves open the option for private right of action. So not only can the city or BOLI administer a fee if you don't comply, but an employee could also file for private right of action and I guess begin some sort of lawsuit with you if you have not given them the benefits that they feel like they deserve. Right now, collective bargaining appears that it will be included. It is not exempt, or it is not excluded in the Portland ordinance. So it looks like that's what Eugene is going down as well, but we're going to discuss that in the administrative ruling process. We'll also talk about a grace period. And then one piece that nobody's really brought up, or we've brought up, but the council has not addressed yet, is how much this is going to cost the city and who they're going to contract with. Essentially, it's probably going to be BOLI, which is who Portland contracts with, but that isn't made clear in the ordinance as well. All right, so I mentioned earlier there was a curveball from the county thrown in. A couple weeks ago, after they took up this issue, they came to the conclusion that they wanted to offer 3 different ordinances for public hearing to discuss whether the county commissioners, should implement these ordinances to try and exempt some people out of the City of Eugene ordinance. The first one would exempt all Lane County government. So essentially, Lane County is saying we have sick leave policies, time off policies that we don't want you to mess with, so we're going to exempt ourselves from it. The second would exempt any employer located in the county but outside of Eugene. So that's going to talk about, that's going to take out those employers in Springfield who send folks in to work in Eugene, letting them not have to comply. And the third is an overarching ordinance that would prohibit any jurisdiction, for instance, the City of Eugene, within Lane County from enacting laws that would mandate employment policies and conditions. So these were the original proposed ordinances. We'll see how those 3 morph or change in the next week. And then, of course, after the public hearing, exactly how that's going to turn out. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about how we got to where we are and what the ordinance contains, I wanted to make sure that you guys all knew the chamber's position and how we came to that. So, like I mentioned before, I'm the Director of Business Advocacy, and one of my roles is to facilitate our local government affairs council. So we have a council of business folks who are members of the chamber who meet every Friday morning to discuss public policy issues within the city, within our area, really. And they look at a wide variety of issues that come through here, and sick leave being one of them. We brought in advocates. We brought in some HR professionals to talk to us about some of the implications of this potential ordinance. And after a lot of deliberation and discussion, that group decided that the chamber would be opposed to this ordinance. And of course, it's voted on by our board of directors as well. So that's how we came to our decision. Some of the reasons why we are opposed to the ordinance. Hopefully some of you have already seen these, but just in case, this is just an outline of some topics that you might use if you're trying to create testimony as well. We think sick leave policies can be costly and complicated. Eugene is turning out to be just that way, with a very vague ordinance and a more directed administrative ruling process. It's unclear to a lot of folks what's going to happen with this. There are studies out there that show that there are hard costs to businesses who have had to comply with sick leave policies. So this is not something that is not going to impact business at all. We think the timing for enacting this ordinance is poor. There's still businesses who are struggling to recover from the recession. Eugene overall has a very high unemployment rate. We haven't recovered a lot of those jobs that we lost in the recession. And when you compare us to Portland, you can't even compare us. We are so far behind where they are in job recovery. It's really hard to look at us in the same light as far as this type of ordinance. The Portland sick leave law is unproven. This ordinance started in January this year. They had a 6-month grace period. So technically July 1 is really the date that people can look at and say, how is this working in Portland? There's not enough time for us to see that Portland law has worked or any of the ramifications of that law either. We did a poll back in March, pretty early in this issue, and majority of the people we polled said they don't think this ordinance is justified. We had a really high response rate for the folks we sent it out to, and they, even ones who did offer sick leave as a benefit already, they did not think this is an ordinance that the city council should be able to implement. The ordinance is confusing and poorly written. I kind of mentioned that at first. We'll kind of see how that plays out, but that's a big piece that's going to be complicated for businesses. All right, so if you are, I got one question here from Jennifer. If when Lane County passes the 3 ordinances, what does that do to the City of Eugene process? Does this matter when who passes which ordinance first? It's a really good question, Jennifer. So as of right now, the real, I guess, argument is over home rule between the county and the city. That is unclear to many people, including some of the counselors and the commissioners. So I think that process could potentially stir up some sort of lawsuit between the two for them to identify who has home rule over those types of laws and ordinances. To be honest, I don't really have an answer for you right now. I think we're all kind of waiting to see exactly how that will work. There's not many issues where this has come up recently, and so a lot of the commissioners who are currently on the board are still curious as to how that will work too. So if we hear anything, we'll definitely let you all know. I think we're going to probably find out a lot at that public hearing and meeting on Monday. Thanks for your question. I know it wasn't super helpful answer, but I have the same one myself. So what should you guys speak about if you're able to testify on Monday? Some points of contention is the fact that there's just not data for Eugene. We can't have a hard conversation about what is happening in our city. I think that in a process that was well put together, that's a piece that they would have included. Similar to what Jennifer is asking, there wasn't collaboration between the county and the city and some of the other outlying cities to sort of bring this issue together to make sure that they were all on board and they supported it. And so now it's turned into kind of a messy sort of political fight between the two entities. So that's pieces that just aren't great policy and aren't great process for Eugene. Some other things that you should touch on, maybe how much it's going to cost the city and where we're going to get the money. That's, again, something that they haven't answered yet. And I think that it's something that the public should hold them responsible for. More importantly, what I think is important is for you all to touch on how much it's going to cost your business and how your current policies work. No one can argue what you do in your business. So the best testimony that you have is to just go in there and tell people, here's what's going to happen to me and my business, and this is what I'm going to have to do to comply with this. And that's a really strong story that they need to hear. And while you're at it, there's a lot of regulations that burden businesses already. So letting them know that this is just one more piece that makes it a little bit harder for you to do business in Eugene. So we're moving through this very quickly, and I hope you all are staying with me, but I just wanted to touch a little bit on why you should testify. I know a lot of people feel like this is kind of a lost cause up to this point, but I don't think it is. And hopefully, if you haven't been to a city council meeting, I can sort of just outline what it's going to look like when you go in there so you feel comfortable and prepared for that. The county commissioners are going to meet on Monday, July 21st at 9 a.m., and the city council will meet that same day at 7:30 p.m. Both of those meetings are located at 125 East 8th Avenue, so over by the park blocks. You'll walk in, and it's in Harris Hall, which is on the first floor. It's very easy to find, but so you know that's where you'll be going. If you are planning on testifying for city council meeting, I would encourage you to show up around 7. There's going to be a lot of folks there, and you have to stand in line to sign up. So in an effort to not be the last person to speak, I would encourage you to show up a little bit early to get your name on that list. Just so you know, the meetings are filmed and they're broadcast live on television, and there will likely be media there since this is a pretty high-profile issue that we're dealing with. Once they've collected all the names and they've started the meeting, they will have a list of the order of people speaking, and they'll give you kind of a cue as to who's next. You can move up front when they let you know that you're speaking next, so it just takes less time. When you start speaking, you want to give your name and the address or the ward that your business is located in. Before you start speaking, they'll let you know that. Some people forget it, but just a reminder, especially because then your council member their ears will perk up if you let them know that you're in their ward. Well, make sure to keep your testimony to 2 minutes. A lot of times if it's a pretty empty meeting, they'll let you have 3 minutes to speak, but most of the time, if there's a lot of folks there, they're going to take that down to 2 minutes. So I would prepare something 1.5 minutes max, just so you can make sure that you maintain that time and that you don't go over. The counselors and commissioners will respond to the public comment after the public hearing portion is over. So if you're interested in sort of hearing what their responses are to all of the testimony, you can wait around for that. And why should you testify? A lot of us feel like this is a lost cause, but I really do think that perception is reality for them. If they walk in there and there is 300 people in favor of this and only 10 business folks showed up to oppose it, that's their reality right then. And they need to see that there are just as many people who don't think this is the right decision for Eugene as folks who do. I think that there's a lot of people who are finally getting on board and realizing how big of an issue this is. And so hopefully we'll be able to show them that we have real concerns. And if you're going to go forward with this, you need to listen to the business community. So while you're giving your public testimony, some tips for this. If you've ever been to a city council meeting or county commissioner meeting, it can be long, it can be entertaining, it can be extremely informative. You learn about a lot of issues in Eugene and some of the problems people have with those issues, and it's a really good process for you to sort of learn where the city's at and what people care about. But one thing that you want to make sure you do is to make your time worth it. So if you're going to show up to give public testimony, here are just a few tips to make sure that it's a good one. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but speak from your experience. A lot of times people have the tendency to exaggerate or use hyperboles about how this is going to affect everyone in town. It's going to shut down a whole bunch of businesses, when that's not very it doesn't make a strong point to the council, since they're already down this road of passing the ordinance. So what is going to make an impact is you sharing your story of your business, letting them know the policies that you already have and the benefits that you offer your employees, and just illustrating that you're not a big bag business person. You actually care about your employees and that you're offering these types of benefits already in a way that works for you. Make sure to keep it truthful. Like I said, don't exaggerate or use hyperboles. It doesn't really help your testimony any. And you want to make sure that you have a strong message that can't be thrown out. Prepare ahead of time. It's really easy to get to a city council meeting and listen to a lot of the other public testimony and want to respond to what everybody else is saying. But with only 2 minutes, you want to make sure that you know what you want to say, you have your points outlined, and that you've practiced it to make sure it fits in that 2 minutes. There's nothing worse than having a really strong point at the end of your testimony and getting cut off before you're able to make it. And then, especially with this conversation and this issue, I would suggest avoid debating the philosophical elements of this ordinance. I think that a lot of us have debates and arguments against that, but the train has already left the station. Like I said, the counselors are on the road to pass this, and I think your time would be more well spent if you could focus on specific pieces that are going to impact your business the most. Because if we can get council to move on some of those, then we can probably influence this ordinance a lot more than if we were just standing up there telling them how horrible we think it's going to be. And the last thing is on that topic is to be respectful. There's a lot of folks who walk in and berate the counselors, and I don't think that gives them any reason to keep listening to you. So be respectful, as I'm sure most of you and all of you would be, but just something to remember that this is, they're volunteering their time, and this is an issue that a lot of them are really passionate about. And so we have every right to be passionate as well, and we want to make sure that we illustrate that in a respectful manner. So that is the presentation here. I'm going to pop back out, and if anybody else has any questions at all, please feel free to give me a call or send me an email at the chamber. I'll make sure to follow up with my contact information, but my phone number is 541-242-2354, or you can email me at brittanyw@eugenechamber.com. So I think that's about it. So like I said, if you have any questions, let me know, and I really appreciate you bearing with us, our first briefing issue over a webinar, for me at least, and hopefully this is a method that lets you stay where you're at, do what you're doing, but still be able to get a little bit of an update on the issue. So we will hopefully hear and see you all at the public hearing on July 21st. Thanks a lot.